The Maple Leafs aced the deadline with two big additions to the club, but was it enough to keep up with the big dogs around the league? We'll discuss that and more as we break down the NHL trade deadline on today's edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Leafs podcast, a daily Maple Leaf centric podcast hosted by myself, Mike DiStefano, and my co-host, Dave Morassutti. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get a $150 bonus in bonus bets if you place a first $5 bet and win. That's $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet with FanDuel. What's going on, Dave? An eventful NHL trade deadline, to say the least. Not just with the Toronto Maple Leafs, but all around the league. A busy day indeed.
It was probably one of the crazier NHL trade deadlines that I've kind of been a part of. And yeah, I mean, I'm still kind of in decompression mode because it's
What's got you shook the most? What's got you shook the most, Dave?
Me shook the most. I mean, it had to be that last half hour before, like in that final window of teams trying to get their trades into the queue.
Brad Marchand's the correct answer there.
Yes,
Dave.
Brad Marchand, because it's just
that's the correct answer.
Brad Marchand coming through, and it's just like I felt like it was just like an NBA trade deadline where it's like, okay, so what's the return? It took a while for that return to come in.
Yeah.
And then you see the return, you're just like, that's it.
That's it. Yeah, considering that, like, today, man, it was a seller's market, and it was expensive for these teams to go out and acquire these players. You know, the Maple Leafs went out and got two guys, Scott Laughton and Brandon Carlo. Will break down those returns, and they paid a pretty penny to get both of them, obviously. And yeah, so I was a little bit curious to see Marchand only go for a conditional second round pick. It feels more like that was a definitely just a favor to Marshy, I think. But we'll break down all the big deals that happened around the league in a little bit. Let's start with right here in Toronto, buddy. Two trades were made today by Brad Treliving and the Toronto Maple Leafs to bolster the club and get them into a better position to compete for a Stanley Cup. That's what I believe the objective was with the deals that were made today. So the first deal that came through, Scott Laughton traded from the Philadelphia Flyers to the Maple Leafs for a 2027 first-round pick and prospect Nikita Grabenkin. And then right at the final buzzer, the Leafs bring in their big right shot defensive defenseman. It was not Luke Schenn. Obviously, he was dealt earlier in the week. It ended up not even being a Rasmus Ristolainen. It wasn't Connor Murphy. Brandon Carlo was the player the Maple Leafs coveted, and they get him for a 2026 first-round pick and Fraser Minton. So giving up a top prospect and a first-round pick for Brandon Carlo. Both those players still with term on their deals. There was also 15% retained in the Brandon Carlo deal. Scott Laughton had 50% of his contract retained as well. And in order for Toronto to get under the cap after making these two deals, they also sent Connor Dewar and Connor Timmins back to their old pal Kyle Dubas for a fifth-round pick, which essentially means that getting rid of Dewar and Timmins cap space. It was a cap dump for a late pick there, and Timmins and Dubas reunited once again out in Vancouver. And Max Pacioretty was also placed on LTIR to get this team fully compliant by just a hair under $200,000, along with Hakanpää's LTIR cap space as well. So that was the day for the Maple Leafs. That was the deadline. Let's dive into these deals here, Dave. We'll start with the first one that came in roughly around noon, just a little afterward, and it was Scott Laughton for a first-round pick and Nikita Grabenkin. What do you make of the move?
I it seemed more and more likely that's where things were going after. You had Braden Shen pretty much. It seemed like that was going to be unlikely because of the no trade clause, and it was later reported that he was not willing to waive the no trade clause to come to Toronto. So it's like, okay, pivot time. And you saw Brock Nelson, he was gone. Yanni Gourde, he was gone. And he's like, okay, like the options were dwindling for the Leafs. But Laughton was still always out there. And I felt like that just seemed to be the match, right? In a lot of ways for the Leafs. And, like looking at at first you're like, first and Bacon, you're like, okay, that seems a bit expensive. Then you see the 50% retention. Anytime you're retaining, especially the maximum half of the contract, it's always going to cost you more. And it just seemed like when you look at the whole picture of it, getting Laughton at $1.5 million for the next 2 years, you like that a lot better than you don't know what that first round pick's going to be. And you like Gurbankin, we liked what we saw from him, but the ceiling didn't seem as high for Gurbankin in terms of where he could be at the NHL level.
No, Gurbankin, I think he's an NHL player. Don't get me wrong. I think he could, fill in third, fourth line winger, pop a couple of goals here and there. He's got a motor and he's a good locker room guy. Seemed like a good character player. But ultimately, he wasn't going to factor in on this team as like a core piece. And Scott Laughton's going to do that. And you said, I think the reason why you have to pay that big price is because you're not only, here's the thing. I know I've seen a lot of people looking at these deals, both Laughton and Carlo, saying you had to give up so much for those guys. Keep in mind, neither are rentals. Scott Laughton has another year left on his deal. Brandon Carlo has 2 more years left on his deal. So you're getting these guys for 2 and 3 years respectively, and you're getting them at the discount. Laughton came at the full 50% freight. So that probably pushed it from a second to a first round pick in the ask. And then similarly to Brandon Carlo, didn't get as much retained there, just 15% retention, but that's for 3 years that Boston's going to be eating that money. So that's costly. That's an expensive ask for a team to eat money and take up one of those, contract slots, they're tradable contract slots or retained salary slots for the next 3 seasons. So, and he's a good player at that too. So keep that in mind when you see the high prices that were paid. A lot of it has to do with the salary retention and the fact that they weren't rentals. These are controlled players. Laughton for 2 years, Carlo for 3 years, and it's not just all about this season. And it also gives you a little bit more knowledge into what your roster looks like next year. So you can kind of start to already game plan free agency. And there may be a big move planned for free agency. We'll get to that in a little bit. But I think that Scott Laughton, I think it was about a week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks ago on this podcast, Dave, I came out and I said, I think this is what the Leafs need. This is what the Toronto Maple Leafs need. It's Scott Laughton. And that was the player who I had targeted and thought would be, the better option. Like, yes, Braden Shen's a better player. There's a higher upside. You could say, similar things about Brock Nelson. But to me, Scott Laughton fit the bill for exactly what they needed. A third-line center who could alleviate some of the defensive responsibilities of John Tavares. So that not only unlocks a little bit more offensive potential from that second line, but it also gives you a really good two-way, strong defensive center in Scott Laughton who can kill penalties. He's got a leadership capabilities, obviously, and you're bringing him in, and he's a good Ontario boy. You love bringing those guys into the Toronto Maple Leafs. He's home. He wants to be here, and he's here for the next 2 seasons. I thought this was a great move. A little costly, but again, everything was expensive at this deadline. It's unfortunate that was the case, that this is the year Toronto wants to move all in, and all of a sudden prices are astronomical, but that's where you are. If you want to stand pat like some teams did and not make a move, okay, you could have done that. But if you want to go out and get a Laughton, you want to go out and get a Carlo, any player really, you had to pay up and pay big. And I'm glad that the Maple Leafs decided to do that. And Laughton fits exactly what they needed. A third-line center who's capable of playing those hard matchup minutes. And I think that this makes the middle six better. Not just third-line center, but it also makes John Tavares a little bit better because he can now, alleviate a little bit more of those defensive responsibilities. This is a career high in defensive zone starts this year for John Tavares. That is not where you want him to be at 34 years old. You want him to be in the offensive end and allow him and Willie to start there and get some offense rolling. So I like this move for many reasons, and that's one of them. The fact that you got him at $1.5 million for this year and next, I think is just a terrific piece of business for Brad Treliving. And you gave up a 2027 first round pick and Nikita Grabankin. Okay, Grabankin may have been a factor for you next season on the third or fourth line as a winger, but that 2027 first, I mean, that guy might not factor into this team until 2029, 2030. Go get the player Scott Laughton who can help you now. So I liked that move. Let's get into the Brandon Carlo trade on the other side, Dave. Keep tuned in here. We'll continue with this conversation next on the Locked On Leafs podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game faces off, the NHL action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even when you miss the opening faceoff or you want to bet on a third period comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking to get a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for a late-game rally or picking a player to score a goal, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is super easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new customers on FanDuel can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. You think possibly Austin Matthews can score tomorrow night against the Colorado Avalanche? Place $5 on that bet. He scores, you win $150 in bonus bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the Locked On Network. Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast. Mike DiStefano, Dave Morassutti with you as we are each and every weekday, Monday through Friday on the Locked On Leafs podcast, free and available wherever you get a podcast and also up on YouTube. We're reacting to the NHL trade deadline. The Maple Leafs making 3 trades on the day. They acquired Scott Laughton, they acquired Brandon Carlo, and in order to make it all work cap-wise, they traded away Connor Dewar and Connor Timmins to the Penguins for a 5th round pick. Let's get into the Brandon Carlo deal because that was the other significant trade. We talked about it ad nauseum. The Maple Leafs, 3C and a Morgan Rielly partner, a right-handed, defensively minded defenseman who's got some snarl, who's got some size, and that's exactly what Brandon Carlo brings to this team. They gave up a 2026 first-round pick and one of their top prospects, Fraser Minton, to get it. Carlo retained at 15%, so he is coming in at a 3.49,
yeah,
49, like rounded up to $3.5 million for this year, the year after, and the year after that. So you got Brandon Carlo, a 28-year-old big right shot defenseman who you could partner up with Morgan Rielly for the next 3 years. It cost a first in Fraser Minton. Dave, what'd you make of that move?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to like the move because I was talking a lot about Luke Schenn, seeing what Winnipeg had to pay to get a Luke Schenn.
2 and a 4. 2 and a 4 for Luke Schenn.
For a 35-year-old Luke Schenn. Yes, he has another year left on his deal.
What the Leafs pay a couple of years ago? A 3?
A 3.
Yeah.
And yeah, Schenn was a rental at that price. But Brandon Carlo is not a rental. He's also only 28 years old. Right, he instantly becomes one of the youngest blue liner on in your top 4. Like I think that it's crazy to say that, but it's like there's a lot to like here. I mean, you look at Mike Kelly discussed like kind of why he was a good addition. You look at the block shots, right? 25th ranked in block shots per game. Puck battle was 35th among defensemen. Right, there's a lot of good things you like about Carlo's game. Now, Carlo is probably not as good as he was a few years ago, right? But I think he's still a solid addition. You look at what Tampa and you look at what Florida have done, right? Especially Florida. Do you want a Brandon Carlo on your team? Like, if you're worried about Brad Marchand and what he's going to do with Florida, well, you got somebody now on your team that knows Brad Marchand very well.
Yeah.
Right? And I just think like the size that Carlo brings, and like we talked about
he's long. That's something too that a lot of these, most of the analysts and even Brad Treliving talked about his length at 6'5". He's got a good stick, so he uses that length to be a disruptor. And I think zone denials, if I'm not mistaken, Mike Kelly, he's what 97th in the NHL in zone denials per game at 2.7. And keep in mind how many breakaways and odd man rushes have the Leafs been given up lately? Like if this guy can work on, if this guy's good at his zone gaps or his gapping and denying at the defensive zone, that should help this blue line as well, especially when you're partnered up with an activating defenseman like Morgan Riley.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? You got somebody who knows this role of being the guy to back up the more offensive minded defenseman, right? I'm pretty sure he was with Lindholm for most of his time in Boston, so he understands what he's coming here to do. You bring up the size. I mean, that you can't. It's so hard to find that, right? And find one that could play those minutes as well. And gonna take a little bit of pressure off of Tanev, take a little pressure off McCabe too in the penalty kill. I do think that. And when you look at what like the last few weeks, even like the last week with Tanev out, it really showed the lack of depth the Leafs truly had on that blue line, right? They needed another right shot. They needed someone that's gonna take that pressure off of everybody else. And he does that instantly.
100%, and that's what he's going to bring. I thought I saw a stat too about Brandon Carlo, and he's one of the better ranked penalty killers. He's in the 88th percentile in penalty killing ranking. I think that was like on a J Fresh chart that I saw. Yeah, 88% PK. So he's in the 88th percentile among all defensemen when it comes to his penalty killing capabilities. And for a Leafs team that's really struggled on the PK of late, it's what 77-ish%. That's where Brandon Carlo could definitely, come in and fill in for sure. And not to say we hope that, Tanev gets injured, but I think we're noticing that, if he gets hurt, this team has no one to replace him, both as a shot blocker, a defensively minded player, and as a penalty killer. And now, not that Carlo can replace Tanev, but at least you have like a decent backup, not, Phil Myers.
Philip Myers,
like
Simon Benoit. Like
Right.
Simon Benoit's going to be playing with Tanev out. It's Simon Benoit playing with Jake McCabe. And we've seen this has not been a very good addition of Simon Benoit the last little bit.
No, but yeah, there was some success with those two last year at times. I imagine McCabe will flip over to the right side and they'll kind of, be where they were, or potentially he finds himself out of the lineup. I don't know. We'll see what ends up happening there. But just for this season, Brandon Carlo, he's averaging 18.48 a game. He's got 119 blocks, 64 hits. And so that's what you're getting out of a guy like Brandon Carlo. And surprisingly, he's a player that somehow he's a +2 on a team that's like -30 in goal differential. So, you'll like to see that. Not that plus minus is the be all end all, but when you see a team that's not playing well defensively and a team that is not getting good goaltending, and they're -30 goal differential, those few players that stand out as plus players, they stand out for a reason. So that's definitely something you like to see. And of course, the frame, 6'5", 220 pounds, and plays that coveted right side. So pretty solid deadline, I would say, overall by Brad Treliving. They filled the two holes that we all knew they had to fill coming into the deadline or coming out of the deadline. They get their 3C in Scott Laughton, and they get their Morgan Riley right-handed defensive partner in Brandon Carlo. They made a little bit of smaller moves to make it happen, trading out some excess contracts. Right? They brought in Laughton. Okay, you don't really need Dewar anymore. You brought in Carlo. You don't really need Connor Timmins anymore. They pick up a 5th-round pick along with that. I think they also got a 4th and a 6th in the Laughton deal as well. So they pick up a 5th, a 4th, a sixth, and they also get Laughton and Carlo. Out goes 2 first, Grabenkin, Minton, Dewar, and Timmins. And that's pretty much the trade deadline in a nutshell. Dave, give the Leafs a grade. What letter grade are you giving Brad Treliving on this trade deadline?
I'll do an A-. They filled both the needs that they had to fill. Yes, they had to pay to do it, but considering what they paid and what they got, I thought it was pretty good value for Toronto.
Yeah, I think I give them the same. I think an A- is a very appropriate grade. I think it'd be an A+ if they didn't have to give up, both their first and Minton. Like those are 3 premium assets that the Maple Leafs had, and they didn't quite get like top end guys for it, I suppose. They got good fits, however, which is why I believe that an A- is an appropriate, very appropriate deal for them. But I'm just taking a look at the potential lineup here, Dave, and what things could shake out and look like come playoff time. I'm kind of struggling to see what happens with 2 players that are still there, like Domi and Robertson in particular. Like where these guys fit now in the lineup, I think is going to be interesting to see. I think we'll see a couple of different iterations of the lineup over the next little bit, to be honest with you. I wouldn't be shocked if that's the case, just to see, who works with who, what works, for Toronto and whatnot moving forward. I think we'll definitely see a bunch of different lineup options moving forward. But for now, I'm just trying to pull it up. I wrote a little graphic here. I'll just share the screen of what, to me, the Maple Leafs should do, and maybe like a projection for game 1 of the playoffs. This is my lineup projection for game 1 of the playoffs here, Dave. So I've got Nyes, Matthews, and Marner. I've got Domi on the second line with Tavares and Nylander. Again, that's mainly because I think they should be deployed more so offensively than defensively, because I got my third line of Bobby McMahon, Scott Laughton, and Kalle Järnkrok. I think once he ends up getting a little bit more minutes under his belt, I think he can move up and play, a pivotal third line winger spot, very responsible defensively. Like all 3 of those players give you edge, and they can all play 200 feet. I think it's a really strong matchup line for the playoffs. And then I got Holmberg, Kampf, and Steven Lorentz as my fourth line, and that leaves Nick Robertson out of my lineup. I suppose you could put Robertson over Holmberg. It really is quite interchangeable, but that's kind of what my forward lineup looks like. Max Pacioretty, I guess, is also in the fold somewhere at some point, but that's what my forward lineup looks like as of now. What do you make of that, Dave? Is there anything that you would change?
No, I mean, I think the only thing you could potentially see is if you need a little more offense from, like, if the third line's struggling to generate offense, you could put Domi, you can move McMahon up. Like, I think those are the 2 interchangeable parts. I know, like, right now, Holmberg's been playing second line. He's miscasted there. He's got to go back to the fourth line for me, in my opinion. And, like,
I was quite surprised in practice today to see Holmberg still there. Now, maybe it's just because those deals weren't done and it was already predetermined, but I would hope that Holmberg moving forward is not on the second line. I can't do that anymore.
You don't make these trades and you keep Pontus Holmberg as a second line player.
No.
Like that to me. Yeah, once he did have that night, the goal in Boston to tie things up in the third. But, like, to me, you've got players who are, I think, more capable of playing in that role than Pontus Holmberg, right?
Yeah.
And so I know that they like his energy and what he brings to that line. But to me, I think you got better options there than a Pontus Holmberg.
Yeah. And then again, I think Holmberg on the fourth line, you could put in Robertson, you could put in Pacioretty. Any of those 3 players are really, interchangeable, I would think, but that's probably going to be like the 14 forwards that you're choosing from that'll play some playoff minutes for you. And depending on how game 1 goes, you can make the changes into game 2. Defensively, I think we all know how it's going to shake out, right? Yeah, Morgan Riley with Brandon Carlo. It's what you brought him in for. McCabe and Tanev. And then I assume Ekman Larson is going to kick over to the right side and Simon Benoit remain at, left shot, defense, although it could possibly be that OEL stays on the left and maybe Phil Myers has leapfrog Benoit. Could be one of those two spots, but that's how I have it on defense.
Yeah, I think it looks how I imagined it. The only thing I would say is, if maybe the Riley Carlo fit doesn't work right, at times you consider the Tanev swap. I know people don't, like, everyone likes McCabe and Tanev, and so do I.
Why would you? That's an elite pairing. Like, I wouldn't touch that. And I think you brought in Carlo to be Riley's.
Yes,
you got to give that a long look.
And I'm hoping that's the only thing I'm hoping for, is that you're going to give time for that pairing to work. I would probably just say, like, I haven't been the biggest Benoit fan. We'll see, Nick. He's now with Tanev out again. Let's see how he does with McCabe and see if he can kind of get back on track a little bit here. But yeah, I think the way you have it is probably the way I envision it. And then the third pairing is just, OEL. Maybe if Rube prefers him to be on the left side, then that becomes Myers' job to lose. And, like, one thing you have to consider too, Myers is signed into next year, right? So they truly see something in him that they want to keep him around. So yeah, it also means Yanni Hakanpää, you're out of the picture now, man.
I think so. I think you look at the deals that were made today. I think they were made with the assumption that they had that extra 1.4 million in cap space, because he's going to be LTIR bound for the rest of the regular season. I think that's what today's deals showed me, because I mean, as of now, as it sits, like, they can't activate anyone off of LTIR unless they send someone down, and there's nobody making enough money that would make sense to send down to activate Hakanpää anyway. So yeah, I believe this is the last we've seen of Yanni Hakanpää. It was not a very good experiment, I would say, for the Maple Leafs and for Brad Treliving here. Who was it that was it with Steve? Why am I blanking? Steve Simmons. Yeah, I kept wanting to say Phillips. Steve Simmons called it. He said this guy can't play. Like, there's true worries about his knee. I'm not sure why the Maple Leafs gave him. I think the original deal was like a multi-year deal too. And then a report came out, and then it caused a stir. They gave him a 1-year shot, and it has not worked out. He played 2 games, and then he got hurt again, and haven't seen him since, and won't see him, we believe, at least for the regular season. The least cap situation tells you that. But there is a way that they could still get Pacioretty back. He's on LTIR. You bring him in. There's still a player you could send down, whether it's Holmberg or Robertson, and you can get Pacioretty into the fold. So his season, I don't believe, is not over, obviously. All right, on the other side, there was one more move that the Maple Leafs could have made, and it would have made waves, Dave. It would have made waves. We'll tell you about that and some of the other big deals that were made at today's NHL trade deadline. And that's all coming up on the other side. You're listening to the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast. Mike DiStefano, Dave Morassutti with you. It is after trade deadline. It is now trade deadline night, I suppose, and all the deals have been made. We finally are getting, some late details on what the returns are for some of this stuff, and we also are finding out what almost happened at the deadline. And the biggest almost deal in Leafland, Mikko Rantanen almost became a Toronto Maple Leaf, ladies and gentlemen. It was close. Brad Treliving made a strong offer, according to Sportsnet's Nick Kyprios. Dave, what was the Maple Leafs offer, and how close do you think things got?
It was, I mean, I didn't realize how we talked about them considering Rantanen. I didn't think that they were actually going to really push the chips forward, and the chips forward would have been Ethan Cowan, Fraser Minton, and 2 first-round picks.
Yeah. Apparently that's what the Leafs offered. Like that was on the table for Carolina. I'd imagine an extension was part of that as
Yes.
well.
And apparently the Leafs, if an extension was on the table, it would have been in the 105 to 100. I think it was 105 to 108 $1 million range total. So in like the $13 million range.
Yeah.
Clearly, that didn't happen, and he didn't get that from Dallas.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
getting 12 from Dallas in a no tax state is better than getting 13 point whatever from Toronto with heavy taxes in this country. We all know that. So
Yeah.
he'll make more money making $12 million in Dallas than he would at 13 and a half, let's say, here in Toronto. But that's neither here nor there. He does end up going to the Dallas Stars. They still got a haul for him. The Hurricanes did. They got Logan Stankoven and a couple of first-round picks and a couple third-round picks as well. So they got an absolute haul for Mikko Rantanen. But yeah, what that tells me though, Dave, like if the Leafs were seriously made a run at Mikko Rantanen now, they may have been considering making a run at him in the summer as well. He obviously now off the board. That's not going to happen. But like, I mean, what do those efforts tell you maybe about what their commitment is to the current group? Because I don't think you could sign Marner, Tavares, and Rantanen, Dave. If they were willing to pony up that type of cash for Mikko, what would that possibly tell us about where they're at with Marner and or Tavares?
Well, first thing is the cap's going up, but it ain't going up that much.
Right.
And I do think it has more to do with Marner than it does Tavares. Personally, I just think that Marner wants that ticket that Rantanen could have gotten, right? Like it's in a way, it was almost like a flip flop, right?
Yeah.
And we heard Bob McKenzie kind of say too that the Carolina Hurricanes wanted a deal centered around knives and picks.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that.
Yeah,
but I don't know if the thing we didn't know is whether or not that deal happens and then the extension was a part of it. Maybe there was a bit of a hiccup, or I think maybe the Leafs just didn't want to move knives. They probably were more comfortable with the assets that they were offering, because clearly we know what they were offering in that one. But yeah, I think, and then you hear CJ on Overdrive say that, you know, Marner's now more willing to go to open market.
Well, I wonder too, though, and this is where the Maple Leafs kind of, you know, really kind of screwed the pooch here. Like if that report's now out there that the Leafs were willing to give Rantanen, you know, over $100 million on an 8-year deal. So if that money's available, well, that's where Mitch is going to go. He just say, oh, why don't you just give that to me then? I mean, I've been here for how many years? I've been working my ass off. Like I deserve that money, right? Like I'm putting up just as many points as Rantanen, you know, has been able to do. Like, where's my extension? If that's on the market, if that's on the table for him, why not me? Like, that's where he's going to go. You know, he's going to go there.
He's putting up that production this year. Rantanen's been doing it for a lot longer than Marner has. And what he has that Marner doesn't have is that playoff success.
Mm-hmm.
I think that.
Oh, I'm not saying I believe.
I know you're not saying it. You're speaking as Mitch Marner right now. Yes. And if I'm Mitch Marner, you gotta be a little careful here, because yes, you can go to open market, but what's one thing that you can't get on the open market the Leafs can offer you?
That eighth year, right? You can go get your $13 million if a team is going to offer that. And I think some people are like, well, what team's going to offer? I think there will be teams that really, if they want a Mitch Marner, they can go out and make a deal like that happen and just clear a couple of contracts. There's more cap space to be available. But yeah, I think I think this is a big ploy from whoever. I don't know where the reports were coming. I'm sure this is from the agent saying, yeah, we'll go to market, because it just. I looked at that Rantanen deal. I said, well, this now kind of impacts Marner in two ways, where the Leafs now look, this is what Rantanen got in Dallas. And I know with the tax and stuff that impacts how much Rantanen got.
But that's for an 8-year deal. The Leafs are going to say, this is what we're going to offer you over 8 years versus what you can get on the open market for 7. And when you're done your 7 years, right, that deal isn't going to, you're not going to finish that 7-year deal like, okay, I'm going to go get more money now. He's going to be a lot older once that deal's over.
Right. Now, you could take a shorter deal, take a 2-3-year deal, and then really
what
double
Wyatt
down on
Johnson just did.
Right, exactly. And really double down on an 8-year deal as your final contract when that cap gets to 113 million, as opposed to doing it where it's at 90. What is it going to be, 95 next year in that range? So, it'll be real interesting. But I think for sure it makes you think, like, what does this team, like, what's Brad Treliving think about Mitch Marner? If he makes that trade, makes that extension, and Rantanen all of a sudden, is a Maple Leaf for the next 8 years at 13-ish million, the odds of keeping Marner at that point drop drastically, drastically. Now, they obviously weren't going to trade him because they still want to win a Stanley Cup this year, and trading Marner will not help you do that. But man, that would have been a real interesting scenario and situation for the Maple Leafs this summer if they got Rantanen traded for and signed, and possibly to do so let Mitch Marner walk. That would have been an interesting situation, but not happened. It did not happen. The Hurricanes also didn't want to have him in the East. They preferred to send him out West, which is also part of the reason why they didn't make the deal with the Maple Leafs. It was like, if you want him, you're going to have to overpay to get him, and that's going to cost you nines plus. If not, we're sending him out West. We got a good deal with Dallas. They get Stankoven, 2 firsts, 2 thirds to get the deal done. And, I still think that Carolina made out pretty good, considering the situation they were in with Mikko Rantanen. But yeah, that was the only other reported deal that the Maple Leafs were close to and heavily in on. We had talked about, Ryan O'Reilly and Braden Shen, if those were 2 players that the Maple Leafs may have interest in. Turns out neither were willing to waive their no trade clauses to come to Toronto anyway. So all that speculation, all that, all the mock trades that we made didn't really matter because they weren't willing to come here anyway. And I wonder too if if they ended up making that deal for Luke Schenn and Luke Schenn ended up in Toronto, would Braden Shen then have decided to waive? Because it seemed as though there was no reports of him willing to waive or not waiving until today. And if that was the case, you would think that the insiders, they would have known if Braden Shen wasn't willing to come to Toronto. They would have known that and would not have made this big of a deal about the interest that it was drumming up. So I wonder if Braden Shen was pretty much in his head thinking, if Luke goes there, then I'll consider it. But if not, and he ended up in Winnipeg, he was like, nah, I'm good then. I'll stay put where I am.
Mm-hmm. And also look at where St. Louis is right now. They just found out Colton Parayko. They found out just before the deadline. Colton Parayko was out for a while, and we know that part of the reason why the Blues were thinking of doing this is because they're a team that if they're close to the hunt, but they're not there, and they don't think they can compete, get something for the assets that are attractive to other teams. But I mean, clearly, also Braden Shen held quite a bit of power in these situations, because I think if he was willing to waive his no trade, I do think he would have been traded, because once Brad Treliving zeroes in on a target, or once any GM zeroes in on a target, they're going for it.
Am I reading this correctly? Was there one more little Leafs trade that came in under the wire?
There was a very, very minor deal to add a
Reese Johnson. Reese Johnson was traded to the Toronto Maple Leafs also. That became official a few minutes ago, apparently, for future considerations. So the Maple Leafs making looks like the final deal of the deadline by acquiring a depth forward in Reese Johnson. Let's find out a little bit about him. He's 26 years old. Right shot center, Dave. He's a right shot center. 6'1", 193 pounds. He was playing for Minnesota, just 3 games this year for Minnesota. Last year, played 42 games in Chicago. He's got 144 games in the NHL with 17 points, 103 penalty minutes, and looks like this is more likely just depth.
Marley's move.
Yeah, Marley move, I guess.
You just traded 2 guys off the Marlies. You need to replenish it a little bit.
Yeah, Grabankin and Minton gone, and so they go out and they bring in a depth centerman, but he's a right shot, so I don't know. He's got a lot of NHL experience, none in the playoffs though. But yeah, he spent most of this season in the AHL, 49 games in the AHL, 13 points for Minnesota's AHL affiliate. So most likely a Marley move there, but that was interesting. I was just looking on Twitter and I saw one. I'm like, wait a second, there was a final move. Yeah, Reese Johnston. You can also add to the Leafs haul, I guess, at the trade deadline, but just a little minor move there. But all in all, pretty good deadline for the Maple Leafs. On Monday, why don't we go through everything else that happened and kind of do our winners and losers of the deadline, and we'll get to see how some of these deals shake out over the weekend too, with a lot of players expected to make their debuts on their new teams. Toronto expected to have both of their new players in the lineup as well, Scott Laughton and Brandon Carlo. They play the Colorado Avalanche tomorrow. So pretty difficult task right away, especially with Colorado beefing up their center ice by bringing in Brock Nelson, and they brought in Charlie Coyle. So Scott Laughton will be going up against a pretty solid centerman, whoever it is, McKinnon, Nelson, Coyle, they're set down the middle. That's for sure. So that's tomorrow night. We'll come back on Monday to recap the rest of what happened at the deadline and break down the Leafs and Avs game. That'll do it for us here today on the podcast. I'd like to thank you all for listening and supporting the show. You can subscribe to the Locked On Leafs podcast on all platforms and receive daily Leafs content. Follow myself on Twitter at Mickey_Canuck. Follow Dave at D_Morassutti, and follow the show as well at Locked On Leafs. Enjoy your weekend, folks. We'll be back with another episode for you guys on Monday. Until then, keep it locked right here on Locked On Leafs.